Working from home, where the hours are made up and the pants don't matter. Or do they? That's up next on Employment Law After Hours. Welcome back to Employment Law After Hours, your favorite weekly series discussing the issues keeping employers up at night. Today, Brian and I are going to be talking about issues related to work from home policies, including productivity and ensuring that you as an employer are complying with all federal and state statutes, rules, regulations, etc. But first, over to Brian for a little legal disclaimer.
So we're attorneys, but we're not yet your attorneys. Therefore, anything we say today should be used for informational purposes only. Please see the full disclaimer below in the description for more information.
All right, Brian, so let's start by hitting the Fair Labor Standards Act and how that's going to impact work from home policies for both employers and employees.
So it's important that employers and companies realize that the Fair Labor Standards Act still is going to apply while your employees are working from home. That means all your non-exempt employees need to continue tracking their hours. So if you've kind of gotten relaxed on employees tracking their hours, make sure you start that back up again, implement some sort of reporting system or some sort of login compliance system on a computer where an employee can go in, check in that they're working, that they started working at a certain period of time, that they stopped working at a certain period of time, and when they took their lunch breaks, if they took an unpaid lunch break.
So what does that look like, Brian, in terms of like what hours need to be logged and what counts as hours worked and whatnot?
That's another great question. So what counts as hours worked is going to be the same as if they were still in the office. So again, short breaks, 15 minutes or less, are going to continue to be paid, but your lunch breaks where an employee is allowed to completely remove themselves from the work environment and do something completely unrelated to work, those can be unpaid if a half hour or more.
So what happens if like an employee checks their email, takes a phone call, whatnot?
That's another great question. So obviously during the day, it's going to remain the same that they're going to be paid for that. But if a non-exempt employee is checking their emails or their computer or answering phone calls or text messages after the workday ends, for example, at 5 o'clock, even if they've checked out, you need to pay them for that time. It's important that you implement a policy that tells employees, hey, if you're going to check an email, answer a phone call after work hours, that you log that time, report it to us as hours worked. If you find out that an employee isn't doing that, you still need to pay them for that time, for example, just like you would with overtime. However, you can then discipline them for, working time that's not being reported, just as you would for someone who's working overtime without asking or requesting that overtime be permitted.
Interesting. So just more on the overtime piece, what happens if you've got an employee who, hasn't necessarily asked to work those hours, hasn't given you the heads up, but it's going to push them into overtime? Is that something that employers need to be mindful of or be paying and whatnot?
Yeah, exactly. So an employer needs to pay an employee for all hours worked, even if they weren't permitted to work overtime. So if an employee works overtime without asking, then you still have to pay them for it. You can then discipline them for violating a handbook or other policy that requires them to first seek permission to work overtime.
But it's going to be important that you have that kind of provision in your handbook. So that might be something that you want to reach out to legal counsel about.
Exactly.
Right, Brian. So the next law that we're going to talk about is the Americans with Disabilities Act, otherwise known as the ADA, and how that sort of works into the work from home policies and procedures that employers should be mindful of.
So as companies and employers need to realize, if an employee had a reasonable accommodation while they were working from the office, that reasonable accommodation may also transfer over to the work from home. So one of the biggest examples we can give is if someone has a disability that requires them to step back from a computer screen or otherwise reduce themselves from a high-lit environment, you're still going to need to allow them the opportunity to step away from their computer for that period of time, that you had when they were working in the office. Again, you can always revisit those accommodations as well with them to say, hey, now you're working from home. Is that accommodation going to shift? Do you still need that accommodation if you are working from home? So you can go back and revisit them based on the change in their work environments. Another thing to be cognizant of is new accommodations may pop up if an employee is working from home. I don't necessarily have an example off the top of my head, but if an employee comes to you and says, I am now working from home, and now these issues have popped up that are affected by my underlying disability, I need an accommodation. Yes, I understand I'm working from home, but there still may need to be an accommodation that is considered that wasn't necessarily considered or needed while they were working from the office.
Interesting, Brian. Let me tee up a unplanned hypothetical for you then. If you have an employee who comes to you who's working from home and they need tools or supplies that they would have been provided in the office, so for example, a standing desk, and they have one in the office, do they have permission to take that home and use it while they're working from home?
Correct. So similar to with the office, if a standing desk is going to be necessary as a reasonable accommodation at the office, that also needs to be considered for at home. So again, that could also be at the employer's cost, unless of course it would create an undue hardship, which is a whole other analysis that you should have conducted with your attorney or other trusted HR advisor. But yeah, the employer could still be on the hook for the cost of a standing desk.
Interesting. All right, Brian, so let's shift gears into workers' comp and discuss how that can impact working from home.
Absolutely. So with workers' compensation policies or insurance, depending on the state that you're in, you need to first verify that your insurance or your policy covers the states where your employees are working. So, for example, we heard of a lot of employees rushing to Hawaii to work from home in Hawaii. Make sure your workers' comp policy or insurance is going to cover them while they're in Hawaii. Even though they're not in the office, you still need to have workers' compensation insurance for your employees. Another thing that needs to be considered with workers' compensation is to ensure that those policies and insurance are covering employees actually working from home. Again, there could be a situation where workers' compensation is invoked while an employee is working from home. I know, paper cuts can get pretty severe sometimes, but just as one example there, a workers' comp policy, you must ensure that they have coverage while they're working from home. I'm sure most do, but again, just double check to make sure.
All right, Brian. So another quick consideration is going to be harassment and discrimination issues. Those can pop up at home too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the same harassment discrimination rules that applied in the workplace are also going to apply while employees are working from home. So you have one employee sending an inappropriate meme by accident or otherwise to another employee. There can still be harassment issues that arise, even it was transmitted over email or text message. So make sure you're constantly educating your employees about the requirements of complying with harassment and discrimination, and reminding them that those requirements still apply even though they're working from home and maybe in this relaxed environment.
And it's sort of just like what we said earlier, this is really a great time for you to touch base on your employee handbook and make sure that you have some pretty strict guidelines as to what constitutes harassment, sexual or otherwise.
Absolutely. So, and then along those same lines, you want to make sure that all the things we're mentioning here today and your other considerations that you're going to have are contained in your work from home policies. You should create an extra policy that goes in your handbook that's sent out separately, covering the points we've talked about today and covering, other legal considerations that you may have or other requirements you may have when employees are working from home.
So I think that leaves us with one more important thing.
Sure.
And that's going to be OSHA. So Brian, if you want to touch base on OSHA.
Absolutely. So the OSHA rules still apply. So if you are an employer who has to comply with OSHA, if an employee were to be injured at home, while working, and that is a reportable injury, you need to make sure that you're still documenting and reporting those injuries. Right. So make sure you're letting your employees know that, hey, even if you're working from home, you need to report injuries to us that occur within the workplace bounds. Then you go through that investigation process as you would as normal. Again, also along those same lines, this would hopefully not pop up if your employees are working from home, but if somehow an employee got COVID while working from home and it was related to work they were doing while at home, let's say maybe they had to run out to visit a client really quick or something along those lines, and that COVID infection may have to be reported with OSHA as well. So make sure you're checking on the requirements of reporting COVID cases with OSHA just to ensure that compliance.
Right. So it sounds like in some pretty much every rule, regulation, law that's going to apply when you have employees in the traditional workplace setting is going to continue to apply at home. But it's important that you make sure that any policies and procedures, your handbook and whatnot, have those clear guidance as well as, provisions that specifically cover work from home. So going above and beyond just specifying your typical workplace.
Yeah, exactly. I think the big takeaway here is all the laws that would apply at the workplace are also going to apply at home. Again, as Monica said, even though some people may not be wearing pants and they're in this relaxed environment, the laws are still going to apply. And, we've been doing this for, 14 to 15 months now. The leniency periods are coming to an end. Employee attorneys, plaintiff side attorneys are starting to really chomp at the bit to get those lawsuits filed, to get those complaints filed. So just make sure you're not subject to one of those complaints or lawsuits.
Right. And if you are, give us a call.
Well, that's all we have for you today on Employment Law After Hours. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, click on that like button. If you feel so inclined, click on that bell. That way you're notified next time we upload a video. We'll see you next time.
See ya.